What if I told you the world's poorest countries are not truly poor, but robbed? That for every dollar in aid flowing in, $7 are secretly flowing out? Behind closed doors in boardrooms and offshore accounts, a global system is keeping billions trapped in poverty, while a handful grow unimaginably rich. This is a hidden truth about money, power, and exploitation. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You're watching Zimo Voice. Subscribe now for more untold stories the world doesn't want you to hear. For centuries, wealth has flowed across the world in currents both visible and invisible. Behind the skyscrapers of New York, the financial districts of London, and the bustling trade ports of Europe and Asia lies a darker reality. One where the world's poorest nations are locked in a cycle of poverty that seems almost impossible to escape. This is not simply a story about numbers, economics, or charts. It is a story about people, about children born in villages without schools, about families trapped in debt, and about governments stripped of the very resources meant to sustain them. It is about a system designed in many ways to benefit the powerful at the expense of the powerless. When we hear the term poor country, it often conjures images of corrupt governments, mismanagement, or lack of innovation. But rarely do we ask, who profits from this poverty? Who benefits when billions in natural resources leave Africa, Asia, and Latin America, only to vanish into offshore accounts, tax havens, and secret deals? And who is responsible when the money meant to build schools, hospitals, and infrastructure is siphoned away into the hands of elites? At the heart of this global system lies a simple but devastating truth. Money always moves toward power. And the world's financial architecture, banks, corporations, and even international aid, has been shaped in ways that often keep poor countries poor. Take Africa, for example, a continent rich in resources, yet burdened with some of the highest poverty rates in the world. Beneath its soil lies gold, diamonds, oil, and rare minerals essential for the global economy. Yet, time and again, the profits from these treasures do not remain in Africa. They are extracted, exported, and hidden. For every dollar in aid that flows into Africa, many more leave in the form of illicit financial outflows, corruption, or exploitative trade deals. This is not accidental. It is the result of a global system designed in boardrooms, parliaments, and offshore tax havens. A system where corporations negotiate sweetheart deals, where banks turn a blind eye to suspicious transfers, and where shell companies disguise the true owners of wealth. It is a system that has persisted for decades, even centuries, adapting to new technologies and political climates, but always serving the same purpose: to enrich the few at the expense of the many. Behind closed doors, in places the public never sees, deals are struck that decide the fate of millions. Mining concessions handed out for pennies on the dollar. Oil contracts that guarantee profits for foreign companies, while leaving local communities with polluted water and barren land. Loans issued by international financial institutions that demand austerity in return, forcing governments to cut education, healthcare, and welfare in order to service debt. The result? A cycle that seems unbreakable. Poor countries remain poor not because their people lack talent or drive, but because their wealth is systematically drained away. But to truly understand this cycle, we need to look at how money moves, and how secrecy keeps it moving. From the glittering skyscrapers of Dubai to the discreet offices of London's financial district, from anonymous shell companies in the Cayman Islands to the hidden accounts in Switzerland, the pipelines of global finance are carefully constructed to hide ownership, avoid taxes, and protect the powerful. This is not just corruption. It is not just mismanagement. It is an entire industry of secrecy, one that flourishes in the shadows of legality. And it is this shadow industry that keeps the world's poorest countries trapped generation after generation. In South Asia, Pakistan offers another striking example of how corruption, debt, and hidden wealth undermine a nation's potential. On the surface, Pakistan is a country of immense promise: a young population, fertile agricultural land, strategic geography, and abundant natural resources. Yet, despite this, it has spent decades struggling with recurring financial crises, inflation, and dependency on international loans. The story is painfully familiar. For decades, Pakistani elites, whether in politics, bureaucracy, or business, have siphoned billions of dollars abroad. Through corrupt contracts, over-invoicing, kickbacks, and outright embezzlement, wealth that could have built schools, hospitals, and industries have been transferred to offshore accounts in Dubai, London, and Switzerland. Investigations such as the Panama Papers expose how members of Pakistan's political class quietly purchase luxury properties abroad while ordinary citizens face rising taxes and shrinking opportunities. As a result, the state's finances remain perpetually weak. With tax evasion widespread and revenues drained, Pakistan has repeatedly turned to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, for bailouts. Since its independence in 1947, Pakistan has entered more than 20 IMF programs, one of the highest in the world. Each bailout provides temporary relief but comes with conditions: higher taxes, cuts in subsidies, and privatization of state industries. For ordinary people, these conditions translate into soaring prices of food, fuel, and electricity. Families already struggling with low incomes are forced to sacrifice even more, while the wealthy often remain shielded. This cycle of debt and austerity has trapped the nation in dependency. Billions in loans flow in, but even larger amounts flow out in the form of debt repayments and illicit capital flight. In fact, estimates suggest that the wealth of Pakistan's elites hidden abroad rivals or exceeds the country's total external debt. In other words, the resources exist, but they are not in the hands of the people, and the cost is visible everywhere. Hospitals are overcrowded, with patients sleeping in hallways. Schools in rural areas often lack basic facilities, forcing children to sit on the floor or study under trees. Infrastructure projects are delayed or abandoned due to lack of funds. Meanwhile, the country's young population, one of its greatest potential strengths, faces unemployment, limited opportunities, and rising frustration. Pakistan's case shows how the global financial system and domestic corruption reinforce each other. International banks, law firms, and real estate markets welcome illicit wealth with open arms, providing a safe haven for stolen assets. At the same time, international institutions lend billions to Pakistan, knowing much of it may not reach those who need it most. For the ordinary Pakistani, this means living under the shadow of debt and sacrifice, while the powerful continue to prosper. Yet, despite these challenges, voices of resistance are growing. Journalists, activists, and civil society groups are calling for accountability, demanding tax reforms, and exposing corruption at the highest levels. The fight is dangerous. Whistleblowers face threats, and media outlets are pressured into silence. But the struggle continues. Pakistan's story is not unique, but it is emblematic of the wider problem. A nation rich in resources, talent, and potential is kept poor not because of fate, but because of choices. Choices made behind closed doors, both at home and abroad. To grasp the scale of the system, imagine a country blessed with vast natural resources, oil, diamonds, or rare earth minerals that fuel the modern economy. On paper, such a nation should be thriving. Its people should enjoy better schools, modern hospitals, jobs, and infrastructure. But in reality, the opposite often happens. Instead of prosperity, poverty deepens. Instead of opportunity, inequality widens. Why? Because the wealth is captured long before it can reach ordinary citizens. Foreign corporations secure rights to extract resources at bargain prices. Local elites, often politicians, businessmen, or military leaders, sign off on these contracts, taking bribes or kickbacks. Once the resources are sold on global markets, the profits vanish into offshore accounts. What remains behind is environmental destruction, communities stripped of their land, and governments left with empty treasuries. One of the most striking aspects of this system is the role of offshore tax havens. These secretive jurisdictions, tiny islands, discrete European states, and even parts of the United States, act as vaults for illicit wealth. They provide anonymity through shell companies, trusts, and bank accounts designed to hide ownership. A politician in Africa, for example, can siphon millions from a mining deal, transfer it to a web of companies in the British Virgin Islands, and store it safely in a Swiss account, all without the public ever knowing. But it is not just politicians who exploit these havens. Global corporations use the same mechanisms, shifting profits from one country to another in order to avoid taxes. A copper mine in Zambia may produce billions in revenue, but clever accounting ensures that almost none of that profit is declared locally. Instead, it is routed through subsidiaries in places with lower tax rates, leaving Zambia with little more than scraps. This practice, known as transfer pricing or profit shifting, is entirely legal, and that is what makes it so devastating. Laws are written in ways that allow corporations to extract wealth while contributing almost nothing to the countries where that wealth is created. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens bear the brunt. When governments cannot collect taxes or resource revenues, they are forced to borrow money from abroad. International lenders step in, offering loans with strict conditions. These conditions often require governments to cut spending, privatize industries, or reduce subsidies, policies that hit the poorest the hardest. Schools lose funding, hospitals struggle, and public services collapse. And so, the cycle tightens. Wealth leaves the country, debt grows, and poverty deepens. Aid flows in from wealthy nations, but often it is only a fraction of what is already left. It is like pouring water into a leaking bucket. No matter how much is added, the bucket never fills. This global system has been described as an inverse Robin Hood, taking from the poor and giving to the rich, and at its heart is secrecy. Without secrecy, corrupt leaders could not hide their gains, corporations could not avoid taxes, and banks could not turn a blind eye. Yet secrecy does not exist on its own. It is protected, nurtured, and profited from by some of the most respected institutions in the world. Major banks handle suspicious transfers without question. Law firms design the shell companies that disguise ownership. Auditing firms certify books that are riddled with manipulation, and governments in wealthy nations allow it all to continue, because they too benefit from the inflow of hidden wealth. The victims, meanwhile, are not faceless statistics. They are the millions of children who never see the inside of a classroom, the mothers who die in childbirth because hospitals lack basic supplies, the farmers who lose their land to mining projects, the workers who toil for low wages while billions vanish abroad. Behind the poverty statistics are human lives, lives shaped not by chance, but by a system that is carefully constructed, ruthlessly efficient, and devastatingly effective at keeping wealth constant. Consider the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country that sits on top of one of the richest reserves of minerals in the world. Cobalt, copper, and diamonds, resources that power smartphones, electric cars, and global luxury markets. Yet, despite this enormous wealth, the DRC remains one of the poorest nations on Earth. Why? Because the profits from these resources rarely remain in the country. Multinational corporations negotiate contracts that allow them to extract minerals for a fraction of their real value. Local officials, often under pressure or tempted by bribes, sign away rights that could have transformed their nation's future. Once mined, the cobalt and copper are shipped abroad, sold for billions, and the money is routed through tax havens and shell companies. The Congolese people see almost nothing. Villages near mining sites remain without electricity. Children are forced to work in dangerous conditions. An environment is scarred by toxic waste. This story is not unique to Congo. In Nigeria, Africa's largest oil producer, trillions of dollars worth of oil has been pumped out of the Niger Delta since the 1950s. And yet, poverty in the region is staggering. Communities live amid oil spills, polluted rivers, and devastated farmland. The profits, meanwhile, flow to foreign corporations and corrupt elites. Investigations have shown how billions of dollars in oil revenues simply vanish each year into private accounts. The Nigerian people, the rightful owners of this resource, are left with little more than environmental destruction. In Latin America, the pattern repeats. In countries like Venezuela, Peru, and Brazil, oil, gas, and minerals have made a handful of elites fabulously wealthy while leaving ordinary citizens mired in poverty. Deals struck in secret allow corporations to extract resources at minimal cost, while tax revenues are siphoned into offshore accounts. The public sees little improvement in healthcare, education, or infrastructure, despite their nation's immense wealth. Even beyond resources, poor countries are drained in other ways. Take the issue of debt. Many developing nations are trapped in a cycle where they borrow heavily from international lenders, often to replace money already lost to corruption or illicit outflows. These loans come with strings attached. Austerity measures that demand cuts in public spending, privatization of industries, and reductions in social programs. The result? Citizens are forced to bear the cost of debts they never agreed to, while elites and corporations continue to profit. And debt is not simply a financial burden. It is a tool of control. Through debt, Powerful nations and institutions can dictate policies in poorer countries, deciding how much they can spend on education, healthcare, or infrastructure. It is a form of economic colonialism, ensuring that poor nations remain dependent and unable to chart their own paths. But perhaps the most insidious part of this system is the role played by wealthy nations themselves. While they publicly champion aid, development, and democracy, they privately protect the financial architecture that enables theft and exploitation. London, New York, and Zurich are just as much part of the problem as Lagos, Kinshasa, or Caracas. It is in these cities that shell companies are created, bank accounts are opened, and wealth is hidden. For every corrupt politician in Africa, there's a lawyer in London who drafted the paperwork, a banker in New York who moved the funds, and a tax haven in the Caribbean that provided the secrecy. Poverty in the global south is directly linked to systems in the global north. This is why, despite decades of aid and development programs, poverty remains stubbornly high in so many countries. The money flowing in is dwarfed by the money flowing out. For every dollar of aid received, several dollars are lost through illicit outflows, tax avoidance, and unfair trade practices. It is like trying to fill a bucket that has a hole in the bottom. No matter how much aid is poured in, the wealth leaks away, not by accident, but by design. To truly understand why poor countries stay poor, we must look beyond their borders. The wealth siphoned from Africa, Asia, and Latin America rarely stays in those regions. It flows outward into a shadowy network of tax havens, shell companies, and offshore accounts. These financial safe houses are the invisible pillars of the global economy, places designed not for ordinary citizens, but for the wealthy and the powerful. Take the British Virgin Islands, a tiny Caribbean territory with a population of barely 30,000. On the surface, it is little more than a collection of islands, but behind the scenes, it is home to hundreds of thousands of shell companies. These companies exist only on paper. They have no offices, no employees, no factories. Their sole purpose is to conceal ownership and move money. A politician in Africa, a corporation in Asia, or a billionaire in Europe can all register companies there in complete secrecy, hiding the true origin of their wealth. Then there is Switzerland, long famous for its banking secrecy. For decades, Swiss banks offer anonymous accounts where clients could stash fortunes without questions. Although international pressure has forced some reforms, secrecy remains embedded in the system. The same is true for places like Luxembourg, Singapore, and even certain states in the United States, such as Delaware, which allows companies to be created with almost no disclosure of who actually owns them. The Panama Papers, a massive leak of documents in 2016, revealed just how widespread this shadow system is. Politicians, celebrities, business tycoons, and criminals alike were exposed for hiding wealth offshore. What the leak confirmed was what activists and researchers had long suspected. The global financial system is deliberately structured to protect the rich while draining the poor. This shadow network is not marginal. It is central to how global capitalism functions. Estimates suggest that trillions of dollars are hidden offshore, money that should have funded schools, hospitals, roads, and jobs in poorer nations. Instead, it sits in secret accounts, untaxed and untouchable. And yet, this secrecy is not maintained by small, rogue operators. It is upheld by some of the most respected institutions in the world. Global banks, names like HSBC, JP Morgan, and Deutsche Bank, have repeatedly been caught facilitating money laundering, tax evasion, and illicit transfers. Law firms in London, New York, and Geneva specialize in creating complex webs of shell companies. Accounting firms design the loopholes that allow corporations to shift profits from one country to another. In this way, the world's richest nations are not only complicit in the poverty of the developing world, they are active participants. The same governments that provide aid and preach good governance are home to the banks, firms, and tax havens that enable wealth to escape. What makes this even more devastating is the sheer scale. Studies suggest that for every dollar of aid flowing into developing countries, as much as $7 leave in the form of illicit outflows, tax avoidance, and profit shifting. This means that poor nations are not actually poor, they are robbed. Their wealth exists, but it is extracted, hidden, and protected by global systems. And secrecy thrives because it is invisible to most of the world. Ordinary people rarely see the documents, contracts, and financial transfers that strip their countries of wealth. What they do see are the consequences: underfunded schools, overcrowded hospitals, crumbling infrastructure, and a lack of jobs. Poverty becomes normalized, while wealth is celebrated abroad. Perhaps the most damning fact is this: poverty is not an accident in geography or culture. It is manufactured. It is sustained by systems that are profitable for some and devastating for others. And as long as secrecy remains the lifeblood of the financial system, poor countries will continue to. When countries lose their wealth through corruption, illicit flows, and unfair trade deals, they often find themselves in a desperate position. With treasuries empty and revenues drained, governments turn to international lenders, such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. On paper, these institutions exist to provide stability and support. They step in when nations face financial crises, offering loans to keep governments afloat. But these loans come with strings attached, conditions that reshape entire economies. Known as structural adjustment programs, these conditions demand austerity, cuts of government spending, the privatization of public services, reductions in subsidies, and the opening up of markets to foreign investors. The logic, according to these institutions, is that by making economies more efficient and competitive, growth will follow. But the reality on the ground is very different. For ordinary citizens, austerity means fewer teachers in classrooms, fewer doctors in hospitals, and fewer protections for workers. Industries once owned by the state are sold off to private investors, often foreign corporations who prioritize profit over people. Take, for example, the experience of many African nations in the 1980s and 1990s. Facing debt crises, they turned to the IMF and World Bank for help. Loans were provided, but only on the condition that governments slash spending and liberalize their economies. Schools and hospitals were among the first victims. Meanwhile, newly privatized industries often ended up in the hands of foreign corporations, which extracted profits abroad rather than reinvesting locally. Instead of prosperity, many countries saw poverty deepen, unemployment rise, and inequality widen. And once a country enters a cycle of debt, it is incredibly difficult to escape. New loans are taken to repay old ones, interest accumulates, and repayment becomes a permanent feature of national budgets. For some nations, debt repayments exceed spending on education or healthcare. In effect, the poorest people are subsidized in the financial system, while wealth continues to flow outward. But international institutions are not the only players. Wealthy nations themselves use aid as a tool of influence. Aid is often portrayed as generosity, the rich helping the poor. But in practice, much of this aid is tied to political or economic conditions. Contracts must go to companies from donor countries. Policies must align with the interests of powerful nations. In some cases, aid is little more than a bargaining chip to secure access to resources, military bases, or political alliances. The tragic irony is that the amount of aid flowing into poor countries is dwarfed by the amount of wealth leaving them. For every dollar of aid received, several dollars vanish abroad through tax avoidance, profit shifting, and illicit transfers. Aid becomes a bandage on a wound that is being deliberately kept open. This is why many critics argue that the global financial system operates like a form of modern colonialism, where once colonial powers extracted raw materials and labor directly. Today, wealth is extracted through contracts, debt, and secrecy. The mechanisms have changed, but the outcome is the same: the enrichment of the powerful and the impoverishment of the vulnerable. The cycle continues because it benefits those at the top. Elites in poor countries gain wealth and protection. Corporations in wealthy nations gain resources and profits. Banks and law firms gain fees. And governments in the global north maintain influence over the global south. Meanwhile, the ordinary people who live with the consequences are left voiceless. They are told to tighten their belts, to work harder, to be patient, while knowing that their future is being sold behind closed doors. But cracks are beginning to show in this system. Investigations like the Panama Papers, leaks from whistleblowers, and growing awareness of inequality are shining a light on the hidden flows of money. Civil society groups, journalists, and activists are demanding accountability. They are pushing for transparency, for fair taxation, and for debt relief. The question is whether the world will listen. or whether secrecy and exploitation will continue to define the fate of the poorest nations. Behind every statistic about poverty, inequality, or debt, there are human stories. Stories of individuals and families whose lives are shaped by decisions made far beyond their reach. When money flows out of country instead of being invested at home, the cost is measured not in billions of dollars, but in futures lost. Take education. In many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, classrooms are overcrowded, often holding more than 50 or 60 students at a time. Teachers are underpaid, supplies are scarce, and in rural villages, children may walk miles just to attend school. Yet, the resources to improve these systems exist, locked away in offshore accounts, drained by profit-shifting corporations, or swallowed by debt repayments. A single contract signed in secrecy can mean the difference between new schools being built or entire generations left behind. Healthcare tells a similar story. Across the global south, preventable diseases claim millions of lives each year. Hospitals struggle with shortages of medicine, equipment, and trained staff. In some countries, women give birth on clinic floors because maternity wards are overcrowded and underfunded. Children die of illnesses that could be cured for a few dollars. Meanwhile, the billions that could save them are hidden in accounts in Switzerland, Luxembourg, or the Cayman Islands. Infrastructure, too, reflects the imbalance. Roads crumble, bridges collapse, and electricity is unreliable. In rural areas, communities are cut off from markets, unable to sell their produce or access essential goods. Without investment, economies cannot grow and poverty becomes entrenched. And yet, the money to build these roads and power plants exists. It has simply been siphoned away. And then there is the environment. Poor countries often bear the brunt of resource extraction. Rivers are poisoned by mining runoff. Forests are stripped bare by logging companies, and oil spills devastate farmlands and fisheries. Local communities are left with barren land, polluted water, and no means of survival. The profits from these industries are exported, while the environmental costs remain behind. These impacts are not abstract. They play out in the lives of millions. A child who cannot attend school because her parents cannot afford the fees. A farmer who loses his land to a mining concession signed without his consent. A mother who dies in childbirth because the nearest hospital has no doctor. These are the true costs of the global financial system. And yet, these people are rarely seen or heard in discussions about poverty. When policymakers gather in boardrooms or summits, the voices of those most affected are absent. Decisions are made in the language of economics and finance, but the consequences are measured in human suffering. The injustice is stark. In a world of unprecedented wealth, billions still live without basic necessities. The gap between rich and poor is not just a gap in income, but an opportunity, dignity, and hope. It is a gap created and sustained by structures that favor secrecy and profit over transparency and fairness. Still, there are moments of resistance. In some countries, citizens have risen up against corruption, demanding accountability from their leaders. Journalists and activists have risked their lives to expose illicit deals and financial crimes. International campaigns have pushed for debt relief, greater transparency, and stricter regulations on tax havens. These efforts show that change is possible, even if it is slow and difficult. But the reality remains. Until the structures that allow wealth to escape are dismantled, the poorest countries will continue to pay the highest price. Poverty will remain not an accident of fate, but a consequence of deliberate choices. Choices made in offices, banks, and parliaments far removed from the people who suffer. In the Niger Delta of Nigeria, life unfolds amid oil fields that pump billions of dollars worth of crude for decades. Yet in small fishing villages along the creeks, families live in wooden huts, without electricity or clean water. The air is heavy with the smell of oil spills, and blackened rivers make fishing nearly impossible. For people like Chinedu, a fisherman whose father and grandfather also fished these waters, survival has become harder with each passing year. Where once he could catch enough fish to feed his family and sell the rest at market, now he returns with almost nothing. The water is poisoned, he says. The fish are gone. And yet, as he struggles to feed his children, the wealth extracted from beneath his feet flows to multinational oil companies and government elites, vanishing into offshore accounts. Thousands of kilometers away, in the copper belt of Zambia, miners descend deep into the earth each day, working in dangerous conditions to extract minerals essential for the world's electronics. They are paid modest wages, just enough to survive. The profits from their labor, however, are routed abroad. Transfer pricing and profit shifting ensure that the Zambian government collects little tax revenue, leaving hospitals underfunded and schools overcrowded. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the story is even more harrowing. Children as young as 10 work in cobalt mines, hauling sacks of ore and toxic dust. Their labor fuels the global demand for rechargeable batteries, the very technology that powers smartphones, laptops, and electric cars. While the world celebrates a green transition, these children breathe poison air and risk their lives underground. Their families remain trapped in poverty, even as billions of dollars in cobalt profits vanish into the global financial system, travel further to Latin America, and the same cycle repeats. In Peru, indigenous farmers have seen their lands taken by mining companies. Streams once used for drinking and irrigation are polluted by toxic runoff. Families lose not only their livelihoods, but their connection to ancestral land. The contract that allowed these projects were signed in government offices far away, often under pressure from foreign investors or in exchange for bribes. The people most affected had no voice in the decision. And then there's the burden of debt, which weighs heavily on ordinary families. In Ghana, austerity measures imposed by international lenders mean higher costs for food, fuel, and transportation. Government subsidies are cut, wages are frozen, and public services decline. Mothers like Amma, who works long hours selling vegetables in a market, find it harder and harder to afford school fees for their children. She dreams of a better future for them, but the reality of debt repayments, billions flowing out her country each year, means that resources are scarce. These stories are not isolated. They are connected by invisible threads of finance and secrecy. A fisherman in Nigeria, a miner in Zambia, a farmer in Peru, a mother in Ghana, all are caught in the same web. Their struggles may look different, but the root cause is the same. Wealth is being drained from their countries and hidden elsewhere. For those who benefit from this system, these stories remain unseen. In the financial districts of London, New York, and Hong Kong, profits are tallied in skyscraper boardrooms. Contracts are negotiated in air-conditioned offices, and offshore accounts are managed with the click of a mouse. The human cost, poisoned rivers, broken schools, overworked nurses, child minors, remains hidden, far from the polished reports and glossy presentations. And yet, these lives are the clearest evidence that poverty is not natural, not inevitable, not a result of laziness or incapacity. Poverty is manufactured. It is the outcome of decisions, policies, and systems that prioritize secrecy and profit over fairness and humanity. The divide between rich and poor nations is not simply a matter of chance or history. It is a direct result of how global power is structured. The rules of trade, finance, and investment are written not by those who suffer the consequences, but by those who stand to gain. At the heart of this imbalance is control over capital. Wealthy nations not only possess financial power within their own borders, they also dominate the international institutions that govern the flow of money. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, WTO, are all headquartered in the global north. Their leadership, voting power, and policy direction overwhelmingly reflect the interests of wealthy nations. When poorer countries face financial crises, they have little choice but to accept the terms dictated by these institutions. The loans provided are framed as solutions, but the conditions attached often serve the interests of creditors rather than borrowers. In practice, this means that policies are designed to ensure debt repayment, investor protection, and market liberalization, often at the expense of local development. Trade agreements tell a similar story. While wealthy nations preach the virtues of free trade, they frequently impose tariffs, subsidies, and restrictions that protect their own industries. Agricultural subsidies in Europe and the United States, for instance, allow farmers in rich countries to flood global markets with cheap products. Local farmers in Africa, Asia, and Latin America cannot compete, forcing them out of business. Once again, the rules are written to favor the powerful. This global order ensures that wealth continues to flow in one direction, upward and outward. Resources are extracted from the global south, profits are shifted abroad, and debt repayments funnel money back to wealthy creditors. Meanwhile, Rich nations strengthen their economic and political dominance. The imbalance is not only economic, but also political. With financial leverage comes influence. Wealthy nations can pressure poorer countries to adopt policies favorable to foreign corporations, grant access to natural resources, or align with certain geopolitical strategies. Aid, loans, and trade deals are rarely free of strings. They are tools of soft power, ensuring that dependency continues. In this way, poverty is not just an economic condition. It is a geopolitical strategy. Keeping nations weak ensures access to cheap resources, cheap labor, and political compliance. For those at the top, poverty is profitable. The consequences ripple far beyond borders. Global inequality breeds instability, fueling migration crises, conflict, and resentment. Young people in poor countries, deprived of opportunities, look abroad for a better future, often risking their lives to cross borders. Others are drawn into cycles of crime, extremism, or violence, driven by desperation. And while the poorest nations suffer, wealth at the top continues to accumulate at unprecedented rates. The world's richest individuals and corporations hold fortunes so vast that they rival entire national economies. Meanwhile, billions live on less than a few dollars a day. This is not a natural state of affairs. It is a result of deliberate systems that have been built, maintained, and defended over decades. But there is another consequence, one that threatens even the wealthiest nations: fragility. Systems built on inequality and secrecy are inherently unstable. The same mechanisms that allow elites to hide wealth, tax havens, shell companies, complex financial instruments, are also exploited by criminals, cartels, and terrorist networks. In protecting the powerful, the system also empowers the dangerous. The question, then, is not only whether poor nations can break free, but whether the global system itself can survive in its current form. As inequality grows, pressure builds. The cracks in the system are already visible: populist movements, financial crises, environmental collapse. What happens when billions of people realize that poverty is not an accident, but a theft? The future of the world's poorest countries, and indeed the stability of the entire global system, depends on whether the structures of secrecy, exploitation, and inequality can be dismantled or reformed. There are, broadly speaking, three possible paths forward: reform, resistance, or collapse. Reform would mean reshaping the rules of global finance and trade to create a fairer system. This would involve cracking down on tax havens, forcing corporations to pay fair taxes where they actually operate, and holding elites accountable for stolen wealth. International institutions like the IMF and World Bank would need to prioritize people over profits, offering debt relief, fair lending terms, and real support for development. Transparency would have to become the norm, with contracts, revenues, and ownership records made public. Some progress has been made in this direction. Campaign for debt cancellation in the early 2000s led to billions in relief for some of the poorest nations. Investigations like the Panama Papers and Paradise Papers have exposed the hidden wealth of elites, sparking demands for accountability. Movements for tax justice are gaining momentum, with activists calling for global minimum tax rates to prevent corporations from hiding profits offshore. These steps show that change is possible, but only if there is political will. Resistance is another path. In many countries, citizens have grown tired of waiting for change from above. Grassroots movements, journalists, and activists are taking matters into their own hands. They expose corruption, protest against unfair policies, and demand accountability from their leaders. In some cases, they succeed in toppling governments or forcing reforms. But resistance is dangerous. Whistleblowers are silenced, journalists are threatened, and activists are imprisoned or killed. Still, their courage shines a light on truths that the powerful will prefer to keep hidden. Then there is the possibility of collapse. Systems built on inequality cannot endure forever. As wealth concentrates at the top and billions are left behind, anger and frustration grow. Political instability, migration crises, and environmental disasters may push the system past its breaking point. Already we see signs of this. Financial crashes reveal the fragility of global markets. Climate change exposes the cost of relentless exploitation of resources. Wars and conflicts erupt in regions where poverty and inequality are most severe. If the current system collapses without reform, the consequences will not be confined to the poorest nations. Wealthy countries, too, will feel the shockwaves. In an interconnected world, instability spreads quickly. A financial crisis in one region can ripple through global markets. A war in a resource-rich nation can disrupt supply chains worldwide. Climate disasters in the global south will fuel migration and conflict that reach the shores of the global north. This is why the question of poverty is not just a moral issue. It is a matter of survival for all. Allowing billions to remain trapped in cycles of poverty and exploitation is not only unjust, it is unsustainable. And yet, despite the dangers, the system persists. Why? Because it is profitable for those who control it. Elites in both rich and poor countries benefit from secrecy, debt, and resource extraction. Corporations maximize profits by avoiding taxes and exploiting cheap labor. Banks and law firms earn billions by managing hidden wealth. For them, the system works, and that is why it continues. But history shows that no system of inequality lasts forever. Colonial empires once seemed unshakable, yet they collapsed under the weight of resistance and changing realities. Apartheid in South Africa was defended for decades as necessary, until it crumbled under pressure. Slavery, once justified as essential to the economy, was abolished after centuries of struggle. The global financial system as it exists today may seem permanent, but it too can change if there is enough pressure from those who demand justice. The question is not whether change is possible. It is whether humanity has the courage to demand it before the cost becomes unbearable. The story of poverty in the modern world is not a story of scarcity. It is a story of theft, of secrecy, and of systems designed to funnel wealth upward while leaving billions behind. From the oil fields of Nigeria to the mines of Congo, from the farms of Peru to the streets of debt-stricken cities, the pattern is the same. Resources are extracted, profits are shifted, and the people who should benefit are left with nothing. What we call poor countries are not poor at all. They are rich in land, rich in resources, rich in human potential. What they lack is not wealth, but control. Their riches are siphoned away through shadow networks of shell companies, offshore accounts, and secret contracts. The poverty we see is not natural. It is manufactured. And the tragedy is that this is not hidden knowledge. The evidence is there in leaked documents, investigative reports, and in the lived reality of millions. Yet the system continues, because it serves those who have the power to change it. The architects of secrecy are not nameless ghosts. They are politicians who sign deals, corporations that exploit loopholes, banks that move money, and governments that look the other way. Still, cracks in the facade are widening. Whistleblowers reveal the truth. Journalists shine a light on hidden deals. Activists risk everything to demand accountability. Ordinary people, from Lagos to Lima, from Kinshasa to Karachi, are rising to say, enough. They know that the bucket will never fill unless the holes are closed. The future is unwritten. Reform is possible with transparency, fair taxation, and genuine accountability. Resistance is already happening. In protests, in courtrooms, in exposés that shake governments. Collapse is a third path, and it grows more likely with each passing year that injustice continues. For those listening now, the question is, which future do we want? A world where poverty is normalized, where billions live without dignity so that a few may live in unimaginable luxury, or a world where wealth is shared more fairly, where secrecy gives way to accountability, and where no child dies for lack of resources that already exist. This is not just a problem for the global South. It is a problem for us all. Inequality breeds instability. Injustice anywhere undermines justice everywhere. If we allow poverty to remain manufactured, sustained, and protected, the cost will eventually be borne by the entire world. The story of poverty is not over. It is still being written in boardrooms, in parliaments, in hidden bank accounts. But it can also be rewritten by people who refuse to accept a world where the many are sacrificed for few. So the challenge is clear. Will we continue to follow the money into secrecy and exploitation, or will we demand that it be brought back into the light? The answer, in the end, is up to us. And as you reflect on this story, we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think needs a change? And if you believe these untold truths matter, make sure to subscribe to Zimo Voice for more deep dive documentaries that expose the hidden forces shaping our world. Together, let's bring these stories into the light.